First of all, good afternoon, but welcome to City Conversations. I'm Michael Alexander, the Director of City Conversations. City Conversations is brought to you by SFU Public Square, and we want to thank our sponsors, SFU Vancouver, the Center for Dialogue, and the SFU City Program. We'd also like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on unceded traditional Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Now, if you're new to City Conversations, and particularly if you're new to a Zoom City Conversation, this is only our second one, let me explain. We do not have speakers and we do not have an audience. Instead, we have presenters and participants. The presenters, and we have 4 of them today, each has just 5 minutes to frame the conversation from their perspective and provide basic information. That way, most of our hour is for your questions, your opinions, and your observations. The point is to encourage conversation, sometimes that Canadians are a little reluctant to do in public. So that's the point. Today, we're going to look at the international response to the COVID-19 pandemic. While uneven, it has shown that humans can react quickly when their health is threatened. Strong evidence is that climate change is another great threat to humanity and to the planet. While some deny that, even most of those people in governments that accept the evidence have not been willing to take action on a future threat with not very visible current impacts. Sure, let's talk about future actions, but don't do too much now that might be expensive or inconvenient. However, that doesn't work so well with something slow-moving like climate change. So is it time to rethink and reframe climate change as a threat to public health? 30 years ago, a group of Vancouverites wrote Clouds of Change, perhaps the first civic study of global warming. It forecasts all the events we are now seeing: rising temperatures, sea level rise, even the melting of the permafrost in Canada's northern tundra, which is one of the world's largest repositories of locked up carbon dioxide. Clouds of Change was adopted by the Vancouver City Council in June of 1990, exactly 30 years ago, and helped shape some public policies. Then everyone moved on to other pressing issues, and it was forgotten. But some of its authors are still around. And today we want to celebrate 2 of them, economist and entrepreneur Michael Brown, and urbanist and former Vancouver City Councillor, Gord Price. They've been thinking about how we might respond to climate change as a public health issue. And we have 2 of the new generation of activists who will face the life-threatening impacts of climate change well into the future. Adriana Laurent-Ziept is the project administrator for UBC Climate Hub, and Rebecca Hamilton is a core organizer of sustainability teams. So, Michael Brown, I believe you're going to start, and it's over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. Now I got 5 minutes, and I'm not sure that I could say everything I'd like to say in 5 minutes. I'm sure the bell.
You'll have other opportunities as well.
Yes, well, that's good or bad. So the question here is, what can we learn from this? So when Gordon and I and a bunch of others got $40,000 we extracted from the city of Vancouver in 1989, I don't think we thought of climate as particularly as a health problem, and we certainly weren't in the midst of a pandemic the sort we are now. So I learned about 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 things, and here are some of the headings, but I'm not going to cover them all because there isn't time. Instead, I'm going to talk about the health issue. And it's interesting, this chart came from an email that I got yesterday from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. And those of you who don't know that program ought to look it up because it's terrific. It's run by a guy called Tony Lazarevich, and he samples American public opinions. This is not Canadian, this is American. Now, you may not be able to see all the detail here, but look at the numbers. The numbers are compared to 6 years ago, which is a fair old time, I guess. The American public has become very concerned about health issues, and I consider it to be these all direct health issues: heat, stroke, storms, asthma, wildfires, disease, floods. More than half of the respondents to this program, and it's a wide range of it's a very good polling system, now think that this is really important. And I think it's become pretty clear that one of the reasons that people responded so rapidly to the pandemic question was because it was their health which was at stake. And so those are direct health impacts, but there are other direct impacts that are to do with how public health works. And they include food security. It includes refugees from other places. And we can't escape the impact of movement of refugees, for example, from Syria to Europe, which was largely a climate-based problem. We have uneven impacts in the case of the COVID problem, and that's similarly going to impact us. I've got daughters with whom I talk, and they, amongst others, are worried about whether they should have children. And then there's a life expectancy issue as well. So I am not convinced that if I have great-grandchildren, which I don't yet, I'm not sure they will make it to the end of this century in any form of comfort. So which countries did better? Well, the ones that did better, and I think these are lessons that can be applied to climate. They were ready for it. They listened to the science. They focused on health impacts. They had inspired leadership. And it's noted elsewhere that many of the places that did well were led by women. And the question is whether or not it was the women that caused that to happen, or whether these were places where there were already cultural attitudes that encouraged the election of women. But look what they did. They were non-partisan, they were non-autocratic. They understood economic impacts, and they made sure everybody's understood that it was a common cause. What do we take from this? Well, first of all, humanity knows it has a problem. We know how to fix the problem, but I'm not sure we're ever going to actually get around to doing that. The evidence is not good. Clearly, there has to be a change in communication strategy, because if what Gordon and I were saying 30 years ago is as true today as it was then, whatever it is that we've communicated to the general public to change things has not worked. So I want to make it clear that in the time since we wrote that report, I've continued to focus my whole life on this subject. And I've decided that one of the ways I define what I do is I'm not an environmentalist. Environmental issues are important. Health is more crucial. So I'm a climate hawk, and I focus, and this is all I care about when it comes to social issues, is climate. So next, I know that many of you young people are quite desperate. You're following Greta, and I think Greta's terrific. She's got two important messages, I think. First of all, you got to let the elderly folks like us know that we never got it done right. And second, you got to focus and concentrate on the science. And the science is both the methodology and the data. And I believe that one of the other things that we have to do is understand the costs in both health and economic terms of accepting what climate's going to do, adapting to it, or trying to prevent it in the first place. One of the things that we've learned from the COVID crisis is you got to make sure that you avoid economic hardship. It's no good to solve the problem because people are out of work. And you got to talk to the market. You got to talk to the people. You got to find out what the people want to do. And I can get into some of the efforts that I've been making over the years to get this done. But above all, don't just protest. Be prepared with a plan, with ideas what to do. Because the fact is that the generation that's going to count here in all of these things is going to be you. The people you're doing it for are you. But you can do it. And I'm convinced that there are opportunities that you can prosper and that you can make change work. Finally, Joanna Wagstaff, the former weather forecaster at the CBC, told me this. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. And now we're on to Gord Price.
Hi. Can you see that? It says, nature. I am nature. I'm physics. I'm biology. I'm chemistry. But I can hear you, humanity, and here's what I'm hearing from you. You know you got a problem. climate change, and you know it's going to take some pretty drastic action. You got to lower your emissions, you got to get off fossil fuels, change your economy and your way of life. And what you're saying is, yeah, nature, it's too much, it's too fast, you can't expect this to happen. So I'm here to help. And I have something for you. Ta-da. It's a virus. Practice. See what you can do. Because I got more. I got all kinds of things. So here's a chance for you to see how quickly you can adapt, and what do you know? Instantaneously and globally, by and large, you are able to respond, and I think Michael has given you a good background there. So that's one big lesson. We know we can do it. It's kind of off the table as to whether globally we're able to respond almost instantaneously to the nature of the threat. And as this session is exploring, do we need a public health threat, specifically something like a virus? I'm not so sure about that. I do think we need something analogous, and we're going to get that too. Remember what we were talking about in January of this amazing year. It was bushfires in Australia. We've already started that season again, expect some more. So like Michael, I do think there are some lessons about how to proceed here. And yeah, number one, science, trust the science. And I think in those places that we're able to do that, you can see the difference now between those that don't. I'm not entirely convinced, in fact, that it is really only democracies who are able to gain the trust of their population in consultation with them that have been entirely successful, nor are they the only ones. I think you got to acknowledge that autocracy can do it too, but it's not our choice. We know that if we have leaders that are prepared and that have the tools, the legislative tools, and that we trust them, that works for us. Let me just quote what Adrian Dix said when he introduced Bonnie Henry. She may, under the state of emergency that she declares and under the Federal Quarantine Act, quote, compel any and all police officers to enforce her verbal orders. Compel the police to enforce her verbal orders. That's extraordinary, particularly in the context of what we're dealing with. But she knew she had those powers. She was listened to and trusted because she did have them, and her set of skills appropriate to our culture and government have been effective. Now, Clouds of Change did not anticipate that we would have to do that. It predicted, as Michael has mentioned, catastrophe. But we never went the extra step as to what kind of response would be appropriate. And that's where I think we are now. These are the lessons that we can learn. We will necessarily base our actions on science, and we will look to our institutions to respond if we have the leadership and we can trust it. And I think to a modest degree, Clouds of Change worked because we were able to build on those things. We did a scientific analysis. I think we were ahead of ourselves on that. And we relied on our institutions, in this case, the city, to be able to respond. And we were influential. I think we were an accelerant. We took some of the directions we were already going. We knew what we wanted to do at that point with land use. Remember, this is 1990, and transportation and economics to some degree. Here's the example I would use. Gordon Campbell, having sat through those public hearings, I think was influenced to introduce the carbon tax, which we had specifically recommended. I think we were maybe one of the first to do that. And so that influence and that effect, I think, has meant, in my mind, I would disagree with Michael on this, I don't think Clouds of Change was forgotten. I think it entered the thinking and was able to reinforce those directions that we wanted to take that have proved to be helpful with response to where we are now. We pushed forward the sustainability agenda. So I think the question is, if we're going to move on the scale and the speed with which we do we need something like a virus, metaphorical and real? And I think the answer, I regret to say this, I think, yeah. I think that's exactly, and we're going to get them. This is where nature has demonstrated it's quite willing to provide them for us in the number and frequency that we're going to need to make these kind of changes. But that means, and this is the lesson I draw today, and the one that I find is very controversial and uncomfortable for people. We are going to need those kind of leaders that will be given the tools and the power to make the changes at the scale and speed required. I've said these are kind of our generals. I don't think it's at all a coincidence that Bonnie Henry came through the military and is quite used to giving orders and expecting them to be obeyed. And I think we're going to need another generation of that kind of leaders, and I think you're going to maybe hear from two of them following me. But that is also a reality. This is not going to happen because we're going to go through a particularly effective consultation process. We're going to have to draw the conclusions from science based upon the circumstances that we face, the catastrophes and crises that we know are coming and will come at an accelerated pace, and be able to respond appropriately. And do I have hope that we can do that? Yes, some. But I think we're going to be tested even today, tomorrow specifically. The park board, for instance, is going to be dealing with a motion to go back to the pre-pandemic transportation plan for Stanley Park. Bring back cars. Open up the roads. Return to basically motordom, the car-dependent apparatus that makes the park accessible, yes, for seniors and for the disabled. Go back the way we were. Let's go back to normal. And we will be tested on this desire to be comfortable with what we knew for a world that we're not going to be able to go back to. And in the context, say, of Vancouver, if we can't meet even that modest little test to build on what we have been able to achieve just in response to this particular crisis that we face, then I would lose some hope, but I don't at this point, because I think we are capable of doing that. Maybe it's time for another Clouds of Change. Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Gord. Next, we have Adriana Laurent-Zib, and she is the project administrator for UBC Climate Hub. Adriana, it's all yours.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, wonderful. So I wanted to start by expressing gratitude for being invited to participate in this event, and thank the folks who organized the event and also all the participants who are here with us. I'm also really grateful for the frontline workers who have guided us through COVID-19, and I'm grateful for the folks who have worked on climate change for decades now. In the past, I've heard folks refer to both COVID-19 and climate change as the great equalizers, claiming that both these emergencies will balance an unequal world. I fundamentally disagree with the statement and would instead say that both COVID-19 and climate change have highlighted how inequality and racism are deeply embedded in our society and our institutions. This is something I've learned both through my own lived experience and through years of activism and academia. COVID-19 has shown us that a public health crisis will disproportionately impact marginalized communities. I'll take some examples from the US. The Navajo Nation, for example, has now surpassed New York State for the highest COVID-19 infection rate in the US. They currently have the highest per capita infection rate. There is also substantial evidence that shows that Black Americans are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and have an alarming mortality rate because of it. It's a little more difficult to draw these conclusions in Canada because we are not currently collecting race-based data on the impacts of COVID-19. Now switching back to climate change for a bit, we know that climate change will disproportionately impact marginalized communities. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are already feeling the impacts of climate change all over the world. And as temperatures rise, the communities least responsible for the acceleration of climate change will also be the ones who bear the burden. Once again, climate change has highlighted the deep inequity of our world and has already impacted the health of communities on a global level. And we've been knowing this for years, as was mentioned previously. There's been some amazing work coming from folks for decades on climate action. And I'm so honored to be able to learn from folks on this, including folks who are also presenters today. It's so crucial to have an intergenerational and interdisciplinary approach to addressing climate change. All that being said, when I think about what we can learn from COVID-19 to apply it to climate change, I think for me, the biggest lesson is that we have to learn that our society and institutions are fundamentally unjust. If we are looking to frame climate change as a public health crisis, I want to amplify the words of Dr. Ingrid Waldron. She's an associate professor at the School of Nursing at Dalhousie University. She says, and I quote, "Racism is a social determinant of health in the same way that income is a social determinant of health and poverty and housing and employment," end quote. If we need to reframe climate change based on the lessons from COVID-19, I'd say we need to center the conversation around equity. This is something that BIPOC communities, BIPOC climate justice activists have been saying for years. For years now, marginalized communities have known that climate change is impacting our community health. Instead, I think the message is finally starting to land that racial justice is climate justice. The conversation around race and anti-Blackness is front and center in public discourse right now. I think it's crucial to address systemic forms of oppression in our institutions in order to actually address climate change and prepare for an uncertain future. An example of this would be that on Monday, Toronto's Board of Health voted unanimously to officially recognize anti-Black racism as a public health crisis. Moving forward, I think we need to ensure that we are talking about climate change in a way that's also addressing systemic inequality. We need to amplify the voices of BIPOC leadership. We need to center science, and we need to center justice to start creating a more just and climate resilient future for all. And I'll echo what was mentioned before. I think we need empathetic leadership with climate solutions grounded in community and equity. And I don't think we can go back to quote unquote normal. And we already know that change is possible. So I think we need to start moving in that direction. And thank you. I hope that was less than 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And finally, we have Rebecca Hamilton, who is a core organizer for Sustainability Teams. Rebecca, are you with us? There you are.
Hi. I am. Hi. Hello, everyone. I just want to start by thanking everybody who's spoken so far and really echoing everything that Adriana said, including the gratitude that she started off with for the organizers of this event and for frontline workers. So I've been thinking about how next Tuesday I will be graduating from high school. I'll walk through a commemorative grad hallway in my school before receiving my diploma from the principal alone, as my parents watch from a ways away. I've been thinking a lot about change. I've been thinking about the bittersweet changes that are unfolding in my life in the context of seismic changes that have reshaped our world in the past couple months. And this is all happening in the context of change I've been thinking about for as long as I can remember, the threat of the climate crisis, a constant cloud looming over the horizon of our futures and the present for many people around the world. So I was very interested to skim through the original Clouds of Change report. It was published 12 years before I was born. Yet I was struck by how it really explained our current state of climate change in ways that are still extremely applicable. And I thought that I was interested in some lines and how they offered important insight into our current situation of urgency. One of the first lines said plainly that atmospheric change is not just another environmental issue. This is true in the same way that COVID was not just a separate health issue. It was not just another issue to be added onto a slate of worries. It's not being dealt with by assigning to a specific separate agency that recommended gradual reforms to our gathering limits and steady increases to hospital capacity. Instead, COVID has been a lens for pretty much every single policy passed over the last 3 months. No political conversation has been had without a consideration about how it would impact the pandemic. Similarly, I think that we're seeing an example of what needs to happen with the climate crisis, which needs to be a lens for every decision that gets made. And seeing the climate crisis as not just another separate issue means that it doesn't need to take away from solving other issues. It can add to the solutions. Another quote in the report was, whatever the impact of atmospheric change per se, many corrective measures are socially desirable in their own right. I think this is a really important point, that the solutions that we need to stop climate change need to create a better world now. Clearly, our world needs to change in massive ways, climate irregardless. For people like me who are unaffected and who have the luxury of looking away, the past few weeks have shown to light the daily brutality faced by Black and Indigenous people, as well as other people of color in America and in our country. Systemic racism is at the foundation of our society. We need deep change to move past this. As Adriana talked about, the impacts of the climate crisis will worsen existing inequalities, but our response to the climate crisis also needs to address them. The climate crisis is not caused by a single source that we can flick a switch to stop, so solving it will require digging up and replacing threads running throughout the foundation of our society. The way we do that deep replacing must also address what are too often presented as separate social justice issues by rebuilding taking away the racial violence and economic deprivation that are also interwoven through the foundation of our society. This crisis is deep. We can't just transition all of our current systems, all of our cars, our heated houses, our manufacturing, to electricity powered by clean solar and wind, because we just don't have enough resources for that. And winning against the interests that we're up against, the fossil fuel industry, comprised of the biggest corporations the world has ever known, is a monumental task. We need everyone in this fight. But in order to bring as many people on board as possible, we need to show how a just transition away from fossil fuels means meeting people's needs now. And this was just as true in 1990 it is now. The report was clear. Atmospheric change means we need to change now. Our society is based on the belief that we've subdued nature, that we can control what's most uncontrollable. And COVID has reminded us how false this is. We're reminded that ultimately we're at the whims of the natural world. We're in this crisis because we think that we can dictate the confines in which nature exists, but it's the other way around. We're at a crossroads, and we have no choice whether or not our society is forever changed. Either we choose how we change our society now, or the atmosphere forces us to do so. And I think that our collective experiences of a worldwide crisis over the last 3 months have shown us how we can make those deep transformations.
Rebecca, thank you so much. And congratulations on graduating from high school. You're going to do great in college. Okay. Now, participants, it's your turn. Colin Stein, okay? Will be first, then followed by Jacques Courteau and Lance Barelowitz.
Thanks, Michael. Actually, Seth, I'm just wondering if you can stop screen sharing just for a moment, because I had some notes written. Thank you. I had the great honor of being able to present last week to the Standing Committee on Finance. The BC legislature, of course, it was remote, to provide some recommendations / requests to a group of MLAs about the 2021 budget consultation. And with every year that goes by, or every week at this point, it becomes more and more imperative to put investment to the provincial level, of course at the federal even better, but at the very least at the provincial level, to address some of the concerns, everything that's been discussed here today. And one of the things on math that may be faulty, and I'd be interested in hearing any questions about this from anyone after the fact, but looking at the GHG numbers, the reduction goals that we have, and by sector, what comes from where, it seems to me that if 10% of British Columbians, and this was my point to the Standing Committee, if 10% of British Columbians were to replace much of their driving with cycling and walking and transit, not completely, but just a majority of their life-bound transportation, 1/3 of our 10-year transport-related CO2 reduction goals, so about 1/3 of 6 kilotons of GHG emissions could be met in 1 year. But we've got a 10-year goal here. So of course, you know, there were a few cycling advocates on the same panel, and we spoke about this and what we asked for to meet the ambitious goals. And we've seen in the COVID response how people can make behavior change at a mass population level. We were asking for investment in active transportation to be increased from about $1.50 per capita. Could be more. It's hard to sometimes discern TransLink spending on active transportation and other at the regional level. But let's say it's definitely less than $5 or $6 per capita compared to motor vehicle investments and ICBC costs and all that into the hundreds, if not $1,000 per capita, made a request for $40 per capita towards active transportation to more aggressively address the planning, the legislative changes, the policies, the infrastructure, education, everything required to make this mass behavior change. And one of the MLA's responses was, well, it's easy to say you should put $40 a person to here or there, but there has to be a revenue stream coming from the taxpayer in the first place to pay for this. And she was saying, you know, you could bring other costs down like health and environmental impacts, but you still got to pay for things up front. So my question is to Michael, to Gord, to others, what can we do aside from trying to play around with facts and make the best case? What can we do, and actually also to encourage all 100 people on the call today to actually write letters and meet the June 26th deadline for written submissions to ask for more investment in active transportation. But what can we do at the political level to make the mindset change, to encourage them to think differently about the investment that needs to be made now for the recuperation of costs later, but to get the changes happening now because we don't have time?
Hi.
Ah, there you are.
Yeah. I'm going to keep coming back to a theme that I've learned in politics more and more. Celebrate your success. Tell me how good things are. Tell me for the investment that you've already made that it has paid off, that you can see it, feel it, do it. That is huge. I don't know if it's just Canadians, but man, we are so reluctant to acknowledge that what we're doing is actually working. I mean, Michael said, climate change has just been forgotten. Well, it's off the board. All of that 30 years of work really didn't amount to very much. I guess I feel kind of sensitive about that. Same with the investment that we've made in that bikeway network that has served us so well during this pandemic. You know, 8,000 people a day in Stanley Park, the beach flowway, the slow streets. I mean, this is really profound change, and it's all occurred very quickly. And with a small additional investment, which we're already doing, we're committed ourselves to, great, we're going to get even better results. Here's another way of looking at it. Transit. We're going to have a critical decision to make as to whether we're prepared to basically go against the 2-meter rule. You know, Bonnie has told us, separate. No, if transit's going to survive, we're going to have to find a way to get over that. Or otherwise that massive investment that has been so successful will prove to have not been a waste. At least we're going to have to go and look at some other choices that we need to make, like serving the automobile. These are the current issues now that build on the success that we already have done, that take us in the direction we want to go. Say it again and again and again. Politicians love that stuff. Give them credit. Acknowledge that it works. Yeah, and then, you know, we'll find a way to allocate the resources, but only so long as we're convinced that there is literal economic, social, and political payoff.
Yeah, thanks. Colin, I think you've raised one of the most fundamental questions there is. And I'm going to tell you my experience. I know what month it was. It was 33 years ago, and it was in August. And I was down in Los Angeles talking to people who ran the thing called the South Coast Air Quality Management District, or SQAMD. And I was there because I was deciding whether I should make an investment in a company called Ballard Power, which is a fuel cell company. And it's still the world's leading fuel cell company, by the way. It's out in Burnaby. And we were talking about public reaction to these kinds of issues. And they pointed out they've done a survey in the San Bernardino area of what people were prepared to pay to reduce the amount of ozone in the local atmosphere. And there was evidence that a family of 5 was costing it $1,500 a year over time because of the health impact of the ozone problem. $1,500 a year. And so the question was, hey family, suppose you were to make a one-time payment. And the median answer was $50. In other words, they were not prepared to relate the cost of inaction to what they'd be prepared to pay to get rid of it. Now, I was trained at UBC as an economist a long time ago, as a Keynesian economist, which is a term you probably don't recall. And so my interest in the economics of this gets down to that kind of problem. So one of the things that I've tried to do recently is persuade the federal government that it should put together some sort of a survey to cover off a generic set of issues that you raise, which is, hey, Canadians, if we don't do anything about climate issues, it's going to have a serious health and economic impact on us all. That's called acceptance. Hey, Canadians, we can spend money to prevent some of that happening, and that's called mitigation. It doesn't happen at all because we've stopped it. We've stopped burning carbon, okay? And we've replaced it with other things. Or, hey, Canadians, we can pay to adapt to it once it's there. So let's compare the cost of accepting it, the cost of adapting to it, and the cost of preventing it in the first place. And the government said, yeah, that's a good idea, we'll do that. And I said, okay, but look, first of all, you got this marketing 101. You got to go ask the people who are going to get the results of this study what they want to know. In other words, you should go to the Canadian public and say, what are the things you're really worried and concerned about? How would you like us to go get data and access all the information? Who would you like to get it? What form would you like it presented in? And we actually went to the federal government with a plan about how you would collect that part of it. In other words, before you did any survey like this, you'd ask you, me, and everybody around the table, all of your folks' parents and grandparents, what do they want to know? And I actually had a written commitment from the federal government that they would do that. That was a year and 2 months ago. And unfortunately, nothing has happened. But I believe that before you ask people to pay for things, you should tell them what it's going to cost and what it's going to cost compared to not paying for them. So I would go, I mean, I think I'd fall off a bike if I got on one. I'm too old. But I think that your intentions are terrific. But I believe it's what you're getting at here is the fundamental generic set of questions, which is, why are people going to be prepared now to change? And what are people prepared to pay now in order to affect that change? And I say one more thing, and I repeated this to a class of grade 9s that I had a conversation with the other day. The grade 9s are 15, comes time for the next federal election, they're all going to get to vote. Don't treat the government as something which is remote. You are the government. You are the ones that can make the change. You're the ones who can decide what kind of politicians and their policies ought to be there. Why isn't it you guys?
Thank you, Michael. Jacques Courteau says that his question has now been answered. So we will go to Lance Barelowitz.
Thanks, Michael. And really interesting conversation. Just back to something that Gordon said to provoke us a little bit earlier in his opening comments about we need some generals, which is an unpopular way of putting it. But yeah, we do need a certain kind of leadership. And this speaks to the issue of, you know, how we are all really our government, and that it comes down to how effective and informed we all are as an electorate in voting and just literally getting out there. And we know that the data is pretty bad in terms of younger people voting. So I would just say this, you know, if we just leave it to the same old, we're going to get the same kind of leadership like we're seeing in the world right now. The Viktor Orbans, the Vladimir Putins, the Donald Trumps, the Boris Johnsons, etc., the Bolsonaros. And those guys are going to lead us to a world war very soon, sooner than most of us want to think about, if we don't address climate change, let alone just the COVID-19 issue, which, by the way, has not gone away. So I think it really behoves us all, me, everybody, you know, to really think about our civic responsibility to go out there and vote. And frankly, Gordon, you know, it doesn't matter how well-spoken Dr. Bonnie Henry is, but we're minnows in this game. We're a tiny little part of, you know, a well-performing part of the world. But the reality is, for most of the world, climate change is bearing down much more rapidly and much more seriously than we're dealing with right here. So I think it really comes down to political leadership and electing the kinds of leaders who will actually be accountable to the electorate, like somebody said on the chat just now. And it really especially comes down to young people, young voters, to get out there in significant enough numbers to actually you know, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And so I just encourage us all to think through that. And my last comment, Michael, would just be, if you want to really scare your pants off yourself, go and read The End of October, which has just come out by, I think it's Lawrence Wright. It's an incredible read. It predicts COVID-19 uncannily so. It's just been released, and you really should read it to see how much worse it's probably going to get before it gets any better. Thank you.
Up next is Bikram Rijal.
So I have one question, which is, where is Canada in terms of preparedness, both in relation to cultural attitudes and science? And the interrelated question is, how do you think the ongoing COVID crisis will help shape the scientific and cultural preparedness in a fight against climate crisis? Thank you.
I had a comment on Lance's question regarding voting. So I absolutely agree. I think we need a lot of civic engagement, and I think voting is really, really important. But I do have kind of two comments. The first one being that there's this kind of belief that youth are apathetic. And I think if anything, in the last like 2-3 years, we've seen that youth are actually taking the lead. So I think that's really important to recognize. But I do agree that we definitely need more youth going out to vote for sure. Another point that I wanted to bring up on voting and civic engagement, more generally speaking, is so for myself, speaking from my own experience, I'm not a citizen, so I can't vote. And there's a huge amount of people who also live in Canada, who've been living here for years now, who aren't able to vote because of their immigration status, whether they're permanent residents or just not citizens. So that's also an important thing to acknowledge, is that not everyone is legally allowed to vote. Which I think brings me to a second point, being that we need to have more transparency on the different avenues for civic engagement outside of voting too. So thinking about like being able to speak up at city council, you know, like all these different petitions, and I just feel like there's so much ambiguity, and it's not really clear how people can actually get engaged civically outside of voting. So I think that's another thing that is important to bring up, is that I think we need more transparency and accountability also in our institutions to address these changes. So those were kind of the two comments I wanted to add.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think also our generation has just really been not, like, the government has not made decisions that represent our interests in terms of, I think many young people are not apathetic, but are disillusioned from politics just because of like our lived experience of seeing crises that affect us not being taken seriously. My hope is that while it has definitely been imperfect, I think that the government's response to COVID has forced them to like actually meet the needs of citizens. And so I think that people might hopefully, maybe some of that trust will be regained in that, like, we're seeing what a government that is really doing many things to protect citizens, to put the health needs of citizens above everything else, what that looks like. And so I think that just responding to that second question, whether this will change our perspectives on science, I think that we are valuing leaders who are being honest to us about what science is and are taking that seriously. So I am hoping that this will change some perceptions.
We've got tons and tons of people out there, and we're normally flooded with requests, with questions. Here's Bill. Bill, you're on.
Hi, I'd like to make a couple of comments. That it's, the last little while, it's been a lot about race, about what's going on in the U.S., but let's not forget seniors are being adversely affected in the worst way, and somehow we don't have anything in place in the way of a rota of seniors. Who needs what? Who is and who's able to look after themselves and also volunteer in their community? Who are out there? Every little group has their own little cohort of who they look after, but there's a lot of them falling between the cracks. And so I like to raise ageism as well as racism and some of the other things that we've talked about. And the other thing, we were lucky with Dr. Bonnie, and we were lucky that we had politicians in place who gave her the right and the ability to tell us what to do and then followed through on what she said. The difference is in the States where they have people that are trying to tell them what to do, and that's not happening because the people don't want to hear what they're telling them. So what we need to elect, because we're not going to get people of Bonnie Henry's caliber as people to elect. We're going to get people who have to be prepared to pick people, you know, at the time of need that will do the job that needs to be done. And then they have to, if that's who they want, and that's the belief they have, and the armed forces idea of a general who is prepared to give orders but knows what they're doing, then we have to elect the people that are able to make those kind of decisions rather than the politicians who are going to tell us what to do. We need them to hire the people or pick the people, I think, that are going to help us get through these things. And I think for young people, and I really appreciate it, my granddaughter will be voting in the next election probably, unless it's a snap election. I think it's really important that you understand that you can't just everybody get together and make a decision, and that's going to happen whether your person gets elected or not. There is layers and a hierarchy, and you have to, you know, it isn't something that you can just change overnight by electing a person or a group of people. It's the system is there. The most important thing is to have your targets, work towards them, be prepared that it isn't going to be immediate, because otherwise you get frustrated and then you drop out because nothing I can do can make a change. And that, I think, is one of the worst things that could happen. And that's
Bill,
all.
thank you. Bill, thank you so much. Any response to that?
What do you think's been the biggest environmental success in our lifetime, Michael? I'm going to argue it's air quality, water quality. If you look at the clouds of change, the thing that's dated the most, we spent a whole chapter on it, is the ozone hole. I don't even think we'd bring it up now. Why? Well, we pretty successfully dealt with it. The increase in the quality of air and water in this city in my lifetime is so dramatic that even if I just described what it was like back in the 70s, people would have a hard time believing it. So to reiterate what Bill is saying, give things some time, you know, set the direction, fund it properly, all those things. Those are big ifs, I know. The dilemma that we face with climate change is we run out of time. We did actually waste a good part of those 30 years. We never really anticipated that we would have to be looking at a situation where we would deal with denialism on this kind of scale that we have. But if you really are, if you do believe in your democratic system, if you believe that it is possible for us to change, then you really do have to give trust. And that means that the politician doesn't just earn your trust, is that you give your followership to her or him. It's a big ask. But in the context of a chaos, a crisis, a dilemma that must be faced immediately, that too is what is required. And as I said at the beginning, nature's going to give us lots of opportunity to demonstrate it.
Thank you. Any others? And participants, we want to hear from you. Where are you? Ah, there we are. Matthew Asuncion.
Hi there, currently here from the UBC dorms construction site next door. Please pardon that. Yeah, just wanted to jump in towards the end. I had a bit of a lighthearted comment / a couple questions maybe for Rebecca, Adriana. Perhaps Gordon could also weigh in on this. Just hopping off of Bill's point earlier, ageism definitely is an issue that has to be addressed. I'm glad that members of my generation have, you know, we're bored. We don't want to be in online classes necessarily. That's why a lot of us are going out or volunteering. I've found my role. I'm working as a journalist right now, helping out the UBC and my paper back home. in that capacity, you know, we're learning about the different kinds of intersectional ways that things are changing. We're realizing the power of ourselves as much as social media movements. You know, sometimes they're seen as trends. This is the first time that I actually see people, you know, for lack of a better word, taking my job, and I'm happy for it, in like looking for information, looking for things on their own accord, and learning about situations in a way that not only they have the knowledge, but they're donating in ways that, you know, I didn't really expect, but I'm glad to see people taking their coffee budgets and turning them into donation budgets for funds in their area and around the world. But that does bring a point as to, I am an American up here in Canada. I'm very pleased by the fact that there seems to be, at least from my perception, a community effort to create change. But on the political level, I know that there's a lot of political unrest over in America, certainly not to the level of other regions or other countries. But what do you think that us being, you know, cooped up here during quarantine, the fact that I hopped on the Zoom conversation shows like one way that teens are taking initiative right now to learn more about their current circumstances. But what ways do you think teens can both learn while we're in quarantine about the experiences of others, especially in terms of connecting COVID to climate change? And how do you think that will roll out come election time? How do you think their participation will change? And how do you think we can become as effective lobbyers with our many, many letters to our representatives as, you know, the folks that arguably have less student debt and more money than us?
Michael Brown is waving his hands. I think he wants to respond.
Here I am waving my hands. So what I did was I faced exactly that issue. What am I going to do? So I decided that I could write down, it would take me maybe an hour and a half, and I could write down the half a dozen things that I could see where COVID was going to impact climate. I'm now at, and I numbered each topic, and I thought, wow, maybe 4 or 5 things to talk about. I'm at 37 topics now, and I have discovered there's an incredible amount of literature that people are using to talk about these various things. There, I gave you a list earlier on. So one of the things you could do for your, and I did it not because I'm trying to publish anything, I did it for 2 reasons. One, very egotistical, which was to see at my age whether I can still do this stuff. And I'm not 100% sure that Mike the reader likes what Mike the writer wrote. But I did it because I wanted to know, and I wanted to see whether or not there were things that we could learn. So I would encourage you, if you're concerned about that, to do it yourself. Sit down and write the things that you have seen happen as a consequence of this that can be applied to climate change. So for example, we have a denier community in the United States on COVID. It turns out there are many of the same people who are deniers on climate. Why are they denying it? What is it you say to overcome their denial? What is it that you say to overcome the hesitancy that many of your parents are going to have believing this issue? Because I know they're there. I mean, my own kids are getting educated by my grandchildren, for heaven's sake. So I think there's a lot of self-help here. Because if you can sit down and figure it out, write it down for yourself, then you're going to understand the nature of the policies and the plans that you can talk with your cohort about in order for you to make your protests effective. Frankly, I think you're going to get a backlash if all you do is block off the Bragg Bridge once in a while. I think what you've got to do is come up with some ideas and some plans that say that we, the youth, not only are the ones who are terrified about this, and you sure as hell don't want to get, you know, the kids catatonic over the outcome, that we're the ones who are impacted, and here's what we think ought to happen. Here's some policy ideas. And when you do that, you can't come up with policy ideas unless you've studied the science, unless you've studied the impact of this kind of issue on other things. But you're all capable to do it. I mean, one of the reasons you're on this program is because you want to learn and understand. And the people who are going to be impacted by this are counting on you to do it. And the people who are going to be impacted are you.
Just noting we're almost out of time. I'd love to give Adriana and Rebecca a chance to.
Absolutely, I was about to ask.
Cool. I'm happy to go. Yeah, I think totally this has been a really interesting time for youth to be living through. I think you were talking a lot about like Matthew, like youth self-education. I think honestly, in some ways, I don't think that we learn very much about how our government works or what's going on in our world or what challenges our world is facing or what we can do about it in school. And I think that we don't learn about what's broken in our society. And I think that now that people have more time as youth, I mean, most teenagers I know really don't have too much going on. And I think that it gives us more time, ironically, to like learn about actual problems. I know in the awareness level of most people I know about systemic racism and about the impacts of the police over the last couple of weeks has just like skyrocketed dramatically. And I think that we now have time to learn about these important issues because they're not things that are taught in school, and we're not really doing school anymore. I think also this time has, and I think people are more interested in what the government is doing because the government is it feels more applicable to our lives now during COVID, when every like government announcement has a concrete implication into, for many people, whether they can afford rent or to eat, but also whether we're allowed to like gather with our friends. And I think that now this greater awareness of the impact of the government in our lives is important and will lead to more youth engagement, because we see that like the government exists. It's not like it feels usually like this other thing that's going on elsewhere because we've become so disillusioned from decisions that are getting made. But we're reminded that it should exist to serve us and that's the point of government. And I think that that's an important thing happening now. And I think also for people who have had the privilege during COVID to not be scrambling to meet their basic needs, I think it has been a period of like self-introspection. I think that like as teenagers, there's sort of a path that's expected of us, and we don't talk in school too much about like what our values are and what we want out of life, and like everything is just so frantic, and we need to make sure that we're able to get a job and afford to live when we're older. And I think that I know a number of people I know have talked about this, to just question what are we gaining fulfillment from, and who's telling us that, and can we gain fulfillment from things other than buying things, as consumerist society tells us to. So I think those are some of the things that have been going on with youth and what we're hopefully, I feel weird saying we're gaining anything from this time of immense loss and grief, but I think those are some of the things people will hopefully walk away with.
Rebecca, not only thank you for that, but thank you for suggesting another conversation, which is what students are learning in school. One of my complaints is that history is essentially no longer taught. And so each generation tends to make the same mistakes as the previous one because they don't know what the history of the previous ones were. But other comments?
Adriana wanted to respond also, Michael.
Oh, absolutely. Adriana?
Yes, thank you. So I have a couple of comments. So the first one, I just wanted to follow up on the comment that's been made around ageism. So I think that's super, super important to bring up. Definitely recognize that that's an issue. And also just thinking about, I think like something that I mentioned before is the importance of community care, right? And I think right now, like the way that we've structured our society doesn't center people, and it doesn't center community. And there's so many people that fall through the cracks because of that. And through COVID-19, we've seen so much organizing on like Facebook groups and, WhatsApp groups to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. So we see communities taking care of each other. And that's something, it's something beautiful to witness, but that shouldn't necessarily be the case. There should be infrastructure for communities and support for communities, including older folks who are also disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So just an important point on the importance of community care and the emphasis of needing empathetic leadership that centers people. So just wanting to follow up on that point. And then on the point that was made on COVID-19 and climate, I think this is just my experience, but I think this moment is radicalizing people. I think we're being confronted with the state of the world, and the state of the world and how it's been for the last several decades, and we cannot ignore it anymore. Like, I don't think apathy is possible anymore. I think people are beginning to understand how policies have a direct impact on people. And it's something I think Rebecca mentioned as well. We're seeing the direct impact of government decisions and policy. And it's having sometimes quite a negative impact on folks. And that can't be ignored anymore. I think it's something that we're finally starting to learn what folks have been talking about for years now. And following up on her point on people understanding racial justice more these days, it's something that BIPOC communities have been talking about for decades. Like, we've been talking about racism and anti-Blackness for decades. And the fact that people are just starting to pick up on the conversation right now, I think is very telling. I think that might also have an impact on understanding climate change. And I've seen a lot of climate leaders talk about the connection between racial justice and climate justice more. So I think that I definitely have hope in that sense, that I think people are starting to finally wake up to the very urgent need to address social justice issues that people have been talking about for years. So none of these issues are new. Just wanting to emphasize that. These are not new problems we're facing. And on the point of self-education, like, I think it's relevant, but I would definitely echo what was mentioned before in the need that educational institutions need to do better. We need to teach history as history actually happened. And we need to learn from our past mistakes. Just also thinking about the fact that it's really important to educate folks on climate change and also social justice issues and history. But there's also lots of avenues that folks who are outside of the educational system right now could continue to learn about these issues as we learn more. So that's also an important point to mention. And it's really difficult to change educational institutions. Like, I work for UBC, and that's one of the things we've been trying for years now, is to address the need to change the curriculum, to talk about climate change, to talk about colonialism, to talk about racism, to talk about how it's impacting folks on a global level. And it is so difficult to do. But I think the fact that there's so much momentum and so much interest on these topics right now, I think will make a huge difference. And I'm very hopeful that it's going to make a huge difference at the ballots as well. That being said, I do need to head out. Unfortunately, I have a meeting at 1 that I'm already late for. But I just want to say thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be a presenter. And thank you so much for participants. The questions were wonderful. And with that, I do need to hop off. I'm sorry, folks.
Thank you so much, Adriana. But we all need to hop off because it's after 1 o'clock. And so we need to end this city conversation. I hope all of you participants will join me in virtually thanking our presenters. Our next city conversation is planned for Wednesday, July 15th at noon. We're working on it now. Please watch our website for information. If you're not on our email list, we invite you to join it, and you'll get a notification of, excuse me, of what the next event will be. All right. With that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our presenters, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.